Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tom Armitage. I'm going to wait a little longer. We're still getting members joining the meeting. Well, I think we'll get started. We have a quorum of board members present, so I'm sure some additional members may join as we continue. So I'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Armitage from the EPA Science Advisory Board Office, and I'm the designated federal officer for the EPA Science Advisory Board. And I would like to reconvene this meeting of the EPA Science Advisory Board. This is a continuation of the meeting that began on Wednesday, March 2nd. And I'm going to be turning the meeting over to the chair of the SAB in just a second. But first, I'd like to just call the roll of SAB members to record who's present. And so I'd like to ask members to please confirm that you're present when I call your name. Dr. Allison Cullen.
Present.
Dr. Marge Elion.
Present.
Dr. David Allen.
Present.
Dr. Susan Annenberg.
Present.
Dr. Florence Anurio. Thought I saw Florence on earlier. Dr. Joe Arvai.
Present.
Dr. Barbara Beck.
Present.
Dr. Roland Benke.
Good afternoon. Present.
Dr. Tammy Bond.
Present.
Dr. Mark Borsak.
Present.
Dr. Sylvie Bruder.
Present.
Dr. Jay Chakraborty.
Present.
Dr. Amin Chen.
Present.
Dr. Amy Childress.
Present.
Dr. Wei Su Chu.
Present.
Dr. Ryan Emanuel.
Present.
Mr. Earl Fordham,
Present.
Dr. John Guggenheimer,
Present.
Dr. Steve Hamburg,
Present.
Dr. Marcus Hendricks, Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz, Dr. Olena Irwin,
Present.
Dr. David Keyser,
Present.
Dr. Marc Le Chevalier, I believe, is not here today. Dr. Angela Lung,
Present.
Miss Lisa Lonefight, Dr. Lala Ma,
Present.
Dr. John Morris,
Present.
Dr. Enid Neptune, Dr. Sheila Olmstead, Dr. Austin Omer,
Present.
Dr. Gloria Post,
Present.
Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick,
Present.
Dr. Amanda Rodewald,
Present.
Dr. Emma Rosie,
Present.
Dr. Jonathan Samet,
Present.
Dr. Leanne Shepard, I believe you're not here. She's not here today. Dr. Drew Schindel,
Present.
Dr. Janice Smith,
Present.
Dr. Richard Smith, I think he said he would be joining later. Dr. Dan Stram,
Present.
Dr. Peter Thorne,
Present.
Dr. Godfrey Uzochukwu,
Present.
Dr. Wei-Sung Wang,
Present.
Dr. June Weintraub,
Present.
Hey,
Dr. Jacoby Wilson,
Present.
sorry to make you suffer through this.
Dr. Dominic van der Mensbroek.
Present.
Great. Oh, and the board liaisons, Dr. Robert Chapin, Dr. Paul Gilman, Dr. Daniel Schlenk,
Present.
Dr. Dina Scher.
Present.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Dr. I'm here. Orange and Oro.
Okay, thank you, Florence. Thank you very much. So thank you all. And with that, I'm
Tom
going to
Paul Gilman's here.
Oh, thank you, Paul. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Dr. Allison Cullen, Chair of the EPA Science Advisory Board.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon on the East Coast and good morning on the West Coast. I want to welcome everyone to the second day of our chartered EPA Science Advisory Board meeting. And I want to extend special thanks again to SAB members who are on, liaisons, panel members, SAB staff office, and with really special thanks to Tom Brennan as director and our DFO, Tom Armitage, and also EPA staff and very importantly, members of the public who are joining us. The first day of the meeting was on Monday, March 2nd. We have 3 remaining items. Actually, that was not Monday. Last week on March 2nd, we have 3 remaining items on the agenda for today's meeting. We're going to complete the discussion of responses to EPA's charge questions for the consultation on cumulative impact assessments. Question 4 remains to be discussed. And this question asks for comments and recommendations to be considered by EPA ORD, who are developing a research plan to improve the state of science on cumulative impact assessments to support agency decision-making. Then we're going to turn to discussing recommendations provided to the chartered SAB in a memo from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. The work group sent the SAB recommendations concerning its initial review of the science supporting 2 EPA regulations. The board as a whole will decide whether it agrees with the work group's recommendations and then discuss follow-up actions. We will also conduct a quality review of a draft report prepared by the SAB Radiation Advisory Committee, the RAC, on multi-agency radiation survey and site investigation manual, MARSIM. This report was prepared by the RAC and it was augmented with additional subject matter experts. All draft reports that are prepared by SAB committees and panels must undergo quality review and have to be approved by the chartered SAB before they're transmitted to the EPA administrator. I also want to note that we heard public comments on March 2nd, and today there will be an opportunity near the end of the meeting to hear clarifying public comments. The purpose of that brief second public comment period is to hear brief statements from members of the public concerning points raised at the meeting today. Members of the public who wish to provide short clarifying comments should send an email to the designated federal officer, Tom Armitage, before the scheduled break. His email address is on the SAB meeting website. So first I'd like to ask, are there any questions from SAB members before we begin with today's meeting? All right, so let us turn to discussing responses to EPA's last charge question, question 4, for the consultation on cumulative impact assessment. SAB members are invited to provide brief verbal comments in this meeting, as well as for all charge questions to submit more detailed written comments. So this question pertains to research recommendations. EPA's white paper makes a series of recommendations for ORD to consider as it develops a research plan to improve the state of science on cumulative impact assessments to support agency decision-making. And we have 3 parts to this charge question. The first part, please comment and provide feedback on the recommendations laid out in EPA's white paper. Are there any additional recommendations EPA should consider? What criteria should be considered when prioritizing recommendations? Part B is asking us to consider the following. EPA recognizes that translation of new knowledge and tools to support decisions is a key aspect of the scientific process. So what suggestions do SAB members have, both for researchers and decision makers at EPA, for translating science to most efficiently and effectively support cumulative impact assessments? And then for part C, what methodologies do SAB members suggest for EPA to prioritize combinations of stressors for research and for analysis? And I would note that the chat is a great place to add if you have particular references or examples that you'd like to share. I realize it's a very brief period of time that we have to discuss this charge question. So verbal comments can be augmented by additions in the chat. All right, so I will open this up now to discussion from the board. Go ahead, Dr. Benke.
Thank you, Dr. Cullen. So this might provide a good opportunity to briefly recap what we heard from the first day. And I'll be honest, in my written response, I misplaced a recommendation that could be very helpful here. In particular, this was the point that it makes sense, and it's also consistent with bias on action, to go ahead with a first cumulative impact assessment. That obviously was supported by a few others. In my case, I had provided some remarks, but in maybe the wrong place. And so I will be revising my response by highlighting in this area to the EPA, moving ahead with the cumulative impact assessment, realizing there will be data gaps, realizing that there are some issues with methods that might not be completely generalized yet, but taking a specific site and moving forward seems to be in line with comments received so far. So thanks.
Thanks very much. And thanks for keeping it brief, and definitely detailed comments are very much appreciated in the written comments. Dr. Guggenheimer and then Rodewald.
So I'd like to make 2 comments. The first is that I think it's important that the report is written very much from the perspective of dealing with local communities and issues involving environmental justice. Under the framework of cumulative impacts, there also are issues of sustainability that have been emphasized in various UN reports going back to the 1980s. And I think that as the EPA assembles databases for information that's related to cumulative impacts, it's important for them to keep those in mind and to incorporate them into the databases as well. The second comment that I'd like to make is that I think that there have been tremendous advances in data science and machine learning over the last 20 years that provide a whole range of tools that can be used in using the information that are assembled by the EPA in the sort of databases, things like EJ Screen. They might want to augment to include other things. And that EPA should really develop the capacity to do research or encourage research from the scientific community on issues related to cumulative impacts that draw upon these advances in data science.
Thank you. Calling Dr. Rodewald and then Erwin.
Thanks. And so my comment really picks up too from, I think it was Sokobi had right at the end of our last call discussed just how important citizen science is and is playing an increasingly, critical role in a lot of the research that's being done, including these sorts of assessments. So one place where EPA could really help to support the future science, as well as communities' abilities to kind of engage or contribute to the process, would be to articulate a set of best practices or standards for citizen science data and even other ways of knowing, that can be used to both help discern which data sets are appropriate to include, but also can be used really proactively to help communities who might be trying to think of how they might be able to get ahead of the curve and start their own citizen science efforts.
Thank you. I appreciate that one, and would love to see if anyone has examples of where they think this has been done well or other things, resources for EPA, please put those in the chat as well. Thank you. Dr. Erwin and then Honorio.
The Cornell Lab of Ornithology, eBird, is an excellent example.
Thank you, Dr. Gickenheimer.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize the need for trade-off analysis, because what I understood from the EPA scientists when we visited with them last time is they really are interested in this more holistic assessment and understanding how health, not just health impacts, but also other ecological impacts, social impacts, economic impacts, and so that's the first step, is to understand those impacts, but then secondly, to understand what those trade-offs are across those different dimensions of community well-being. And I agree with what Dr. Gickenheimer said about sustainability indicators. There's a ton of research and existing scholarship that can be drawn on in terms of sustainability indicators, but then also how communities have been engaged in identifying those indicators. And then the next step in that process would be to try to quantify trade-offs across those indicators. And I think, for that, you need multiple data on multiple communities, because you need that variation to really identify that. And so EPA, I think, could be pretty instrumental in helping through their various tools they already have. They've pulled together a lot of great data at a community level across multiple communities, but to continue to work on that in a purposeful way so that we could have a set of estimates that help to inform what the trade-offs could be for different communities that have different characteristics.
Thank you. Dr. Honorio and then Dr. Wilson.
So I'll like to add to the comment on the citizen science. Dr. Wilson also talked about it on during our last meeting, and I think it's an underutilized and to some extent neglected aspect of gathering data. There has been tremendous improvement on how citizen science can help expand and enhance data collection, especially when it comes to cumulative impact assessment or even risk assessment. It's amazing how much information can be gathered from communities, especially when the local stakeholders or community leaders are working hand in hand with scientists. It involves mentoring and a lot of education and training, and also the youth in those communities engaged in those data collection. It also makes them feel like they are part of the data collected about what would affect their lives. So I think that should be really looked at. And for that, and also I included in my comment lived experience. A lot of these communities, we tend to not incorporate their life experiences, what they've dealt with throughout from generation to generation in terms of exposure to multiple chemicals and non-chemical stressors. So those have to be included in all of this, and that's one of the statements that I included in my response. And it will give a holistic assessment of all of the things and probably close some of the gaps that we've been talking about.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson.
I'll try not to talk too much because it's really important points have already been made. But I think it's on the last point about lived experience in Bayesian terms, that's specificatory knowledge. So we need to value specificatory knowledge more, right? I do believe there's multiple examples. I would go back, as I said to some of my EPA colleagues previously, when I was on NEJAC, the CARE program was a program where you actually were putting in real life, looking at cumulative impacts and actually doing something about it. Go back to the CARE program. I mean, that already had a lot of these elements of looking at multiple stressors, engaging community, doing community science, doing risk prioritization. That's really important. I would say look at the work of the EPA. I think Dr. Frey may have already done it, but the EPA has a citizen science toolkit. EDF has a citizen science toolkit. Cal EPA, Cal Health has a citizen science kind of monitoring toolkit. So there's a lot of work that's been done on the advancing the tool side. And I would say also getting to the point about the screening tools, there are multiple screening tools that are out there. I built Maryland EJ Screen. I contributed to updating US EPA EJ Screen 2.0 that came out through NEJAC and Calivarro Screen. So look to those agencies and entities who are building those tools because they're doing very innovative work, bringing in those ecologic stressors. I mean, across like the different stressors, the chemical stressors, the biological stressors, the ecologic stressors, the physical stressors, and the psychosocial stressors. In our tool, we're doing that too. We're bringing the NASA data as well into our tool. So I would say not to speak too much more, but Washington State's tool, California's tool, Michigan has a tool coming out, Minnesota has a tool coming out, Wisconsin has an RFP on tool. Massachusetts right now is working on integrating cumulative impact assessments into its air quality permitting. Look to that as an example. New Jersey DEP and the cumulative impact bill that was passed, look to that for this work. They're engaged communities. We're working in the South Ward of New Jersey to help with some of that work. And there's other states that have screening tools too, like I think Rhode Island has a tool, North Carolina has a tool. Mostly they're on the coast, not a lot in the central part of the country. And I'll stop there. That's all I want to say about, I get excited about community science, but I think community science is really, really important. There's a lot of examples of that out there. Look to Citizen Science Association, some of this work, look to the Thriving Earth Exchange and what it's doing as well. And also look to Community Campus Partnerships for Health as entities that have been doing a lot of this work with communities that could be leveraged for what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacoby. And before I call on Dr. Pullen-Fednick, I should just say, I probably wasn't very clear. We're getting great comments on all three parts of the question, but maybe I should try to focus us a little bit on each one. You know, some of them are cross-cutting, so obviously they work for more than one, but I want to make sure I don't leave out anything that would spur someone. So part A in particular, are there any additional recommendations EPA should consider? What criteria for prioritizing these recommendations? Yeah, so I want to make sure to focus us a little bit on each part, as well as some of these, obviously cross-cutting is great. Dr. Pullen-Fednick.
Yeah, one question that came up for me in reading through the document, is the concept of adverse outcome pathways was, kind of spotted throughout the document. And one of the things that I found missing, and maybe I missed it, but, really trying to understand the ways in which the agency is proposing to utilize, these, say, new approach methodologies to try to assess some of the issues that we're talking about. And I think even more critically, identifying the weaknesses of those tools and being able to bring together information in a way that's ultimately protective of communities. And so, really being able to understand, again, having those molecular pathways in there can be both helpful and dangerous. And so understanding the agency thinking and what the recommendations would be in utilizing those tools would be really critical, that I didn't see as something that was in there.
Thanks, no, great points. Thanks so much. Others in particular on part A, and I will call the other two parts explicitly as well, just to make sure that we're catching everything. All right, well, we can always cross-cut back, but let's turn to B for a minute. EPA recognizes translation of new knowledge and tools to support decisions being a key aspect. What suggestions do we have for translating science to most effectively support cumulative impact assessments? We've heard a little bit of this, but let's hear if there's anything specific that someone wants to raise. And welcome to those who are joining us. We had a couple of people who had things they needed to attend to earlier, so welcome. Let's see, Dr. Wilson and then Dr. Pullen-Fednick.
I apologize. Most of my comments from the previous question were for this question about translation.
No, I understand it. I should have been calling it in order. Sorry.
And just to dig into that, another program to look to that I think you have. So there, the Centers of Excellence on Environmental Health Disparities, the Superfund centers that have been funded, and also the NIHS's Partnerships Environmental Public Health Program. I think that's a place to look to where people have been doing, cumulative impacts and working with communities and doing translation action. So those would be three centers three things to look to for best practices and lessons learned and things that we can replicate and integrate into, particularly particularly the Centers of Excellence, because that's an EPA NIH collaborative. That program is. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Pullen-Fednick and then Dr. Borsak.
Yeah, and I think that Dr. Benke said this earlier too about being able to actually show an instance in which the agency is utilizing this framework. I think that to the extent that the agency can do this, going through the the various dockets that have been open, RMP facilities is one place that comes to mind for me, to identify the places where communities want these types of tools applied and apply them, right, and show the pathway forward toward protecting those communities. If the ultimate goal here really is to make sure that protection is passed, along in this country in a way that, isn't leaving folks behind.
Thank you. Great comments on centering protection. Dr. Borsak.
Yeah, I think I'll just use this as an opportunity. I had this in my written comments, and it's something I've done a little bit of work on. But as we all know, when there's uncertainty, it might be a reason to be especially precautionary. And one of the things I've worked on is when you have correlated uncertainty among multiple impacts or stressors, that might be a particular reason, because most causes of stressors are, there's many similar causes of multiple stressors. And so that means when you're uncertain of the impacts, if one turns out to be a little higher than you might expect, then others will be as well. And so that is a further argument for precaution. And I think it's something that's often overlooked. Like I said, I had quite a bit of that in my written comments. But in this particular question of translation, I think how you communicate that, in general, how you communicate uncertainty, and especially the somewhat more subtle but important point of correlated uncertainty or correlated or covariances across stressors, will be an important thing to somehow account for.
Thanks. Yeah, that cascading uncertainty and interacting. So thank you. Others on Part B, especially about translating. You see the chat's been active with some ideas about some references, and a little shout out there to an EPA STAR grant that produced a nice document that Dr. Wilson was alluding to. So thank you, Dr. Frey. Let's move to the third part. So this is about methodologies. And again, we've been hearing this throughout because it is overarching, but are there particular methodologies that we suggest for EPA to prioritize combinations of stressors? And Dr. Borsak's last comment is actually an example of this too, in some ways, translational as well as on methodologies for prioritizing combinations. Questions for EPA about this, clarifying what that charge question was, or particular comments? We did get quite a bit in the written comments earlier, and we'll have another round of those after this meeting. Dr. Borsak, did you want to hop in again? Let's see, Dr. Shu.
Hi, I'm sorry I missed the end of the last meeting, so I apologize if this came up at that point. But one of the things I suggested in my written comments was to apply some systematic evidence mapping tools. Now, systematic review per se, I think is too onerous, and we'll get into this paralysis by analysis. But in terms of prioritizing, identifying potential stressors, I think the evidence mapping tools, a lot of which have really advanced in terms of, augmented by machine learning, I think have the potential to really, help scope out really the universe of potentially important stressors. And of course, in consultation with communities, looking at what types of stressors they are interested in, as well as being able to identify gaps, because that's another real benefit of these evidence maps, to identify where there's a lack of data.
Thank you. Great points. Others in particular on part C. All right, well, we had a very robust discussion of the first charge questions, some of which also, that conversation also applies here. And then we're getting great written comments. So I think maybe we'll, unless someone hops in with a hand, I think maybe we'll move to our other topics. Oh, Dr. Pullen-Fednick, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, just to emphasize again, I think prioritization should also, to the extent possible, be, minimize the burden that's placed on communities, but identify the places where communities most want this work to be prioritized too. So I love, coming up with very specific types of methods, but ultimately, finding out what people most want and the people that are most impacted, and leaning on that is a good way to go too.
Yeah, thanks. And anything that folks have great examples of priorities from different subpopulations being woven together, or different groups of individuals, because that's also quite interesting when the priorities differ among different groups. Thank you, Dr. Pullen-Fednick. I'll give it just another few seconds here. I don't want to rush anyone. All right, well, we do have quite a bit to cover across all of our areas. So I really appreciate the conversation last time. I know it ran a little bit over, and I think that probably helped us save a little bit of time today as well. So thank you so much. Written comments are due to Tom Armitage by the 25th of March, which is a Friday. And we welcome, again, updated comments in addition to the initial ones that some sent in, or just new comments from folks who weren't able to put in earlier ones. All of that would be very much welcome. Thanks so much to SAB members and board liaisons. This discussion really high quality and very much appreciated. So we're going to change gears now. We're going to discuss the recommendations received from the work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. And I want to say just a few words about the responsibilities of this SAB work group. So the SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about the science that supports planned actions when those actions are provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment. And the board may decide to review the adequacy of the scientific and technical underpinnings of those planned actions. The work group thus plays a really important role in this process because it makes initial recommendations to the full SAB about whether there is a need to review science supporting planned actions, does some of that front work. And then, of course, we confer with the entire board to make the final decision about which recommendations and how we'd like to proceed. A little history on this. So the SAB work group, whose memo you received today, this is the work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions, was formed last November. The work group has 12 members. I am chairing David Allen, Jay Chakraborty, Stephen Hamburg, Marcus Hendricks, Sheila Olmsted, Christy Pullen-Fednick, Amanda Rodewall, Jonathan Samet, Richard Smith, Peter Thorne, and June Weintraub. So we have a 12-member working group, as I said. We met on December 13th, 2021, and also January 28th, 2022, because we didn't yet have our process in place that was mentioned in our last week's full SAB meeting. We were operating under a previous process, and we were responding actually in each case to actions that EPA brought to us and asked to discuss with us, which was wonderful. So we met and discussed two actions: EPA's revised 2023 and later model year light duty vehicle greenhouse gas emissions standards. That's RIN 2060 AV13. And EPA's revised definitions of waters of the United States, and that's RIN 2040 AG13. The memorandum that went to the board dated February 7th, 2022 documents the recommendations from the work group and provides some background information about these. Our board as a whole will now discuss the work group recommendations and will reach agreement on any actions that we need to take. And before we move to the discussion, I would like to ask if any board members have questions about this process. And if I can't answer them, we have other people also on the call who will be able to answer them. I don't see questions. All right, so we're going to first discuss the work group recommendations and findings regarding EPA's proposed rule to revise definition of waters in the US. I want to note that staff from the EPA Office of Water and Department of the Army are at this meeting, so they can help us answer questions that we might have as well. And we're going to begin with a brief review by Dr. Rodewald of the work group's findings and recommendations on this proposed rule.
Great. Thank you. Yes, so the work group members, we discussed the proposed rule to revise the definition of the waters of the US that was published on the Federal Register in early December. And so this rule restores the pre-2015 definition of waters of the US. So pending, just another piece of information to keep in mind is that, pending the relevant case that's currently being considered by the Supreme Court, the EPA and Army Corps staff have indicated that they anticipate a second rulemaking is going to follow later this year that will build upon this proposed rule. So in our conversation, the work group decided that we do recommend that the chartered SAB consider whether a review of the science supporting this proposed revised definition is warranted. And so we make that recommendation based on a few points. So one is that the action is influential. It will set a precedent. It's expected to have a major impact on decisions and regulations being made. And it, of course, is controversial. There also are aspects of the proposed rule that involve some emerging environmental issues that should be considered. And these are issues that are consistent with the points that the SAB raised in a commentary to Administrator Wheeler in February of 2020. It's also, we thought it would be useful for the chartered SAB to provide advice on EPA regarding new science that might inform the rulemaking. So some examples of topics that we thought would be important to consider include the manner in which economic analyses of costs and benefits are being conducted at national, subpopulation, and regional scales, emerging issues that could affect the current standards, especially in terms of which waters, are jurisdictional, given changes that we would expect to see from, climate, changing hydrological patterns, and the like that should be pretty influential. We thought it would be useful to discuss the current exclusion of groundwater and the extent to which that continues to be supported or not based on recent science regarding connectivity of surface and subsurface waters. And then finally, how new approaches might be useful in helping to account for potential impacts on people of color and low-income and overburdened communities. So for all of those reasons, we again recommended that the SAB review the science consider whether or not we need to have a formal review of the science underlying this rule. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Rodewald, and thank you to all of the workgroup members for their efforts on this. So I now open it up to the full board for a discussion of these workgroup recommendations. And if others from the workgroup would like to add their comments first, we could certainly make space for that.
I have a point of clarification. This is Enid Neptune. I was just wondering, do we have a coherent definition of what an overburdened community is?
That's an excellent question. Would others like to respond to that? I mean, I think EPA could respond in terms of how they're viewing that at present. Others could as well, and we may find that different folks have different definitions. So I appreciate the question very much. I can kick it off by reflecting, and I expect EPA to hop in as well. EPA has been using low income, overburdened in terms of geospatial location and exposure to contaminants, people of color, and vulnerability in a variety of lenses as well. And I welcome others to join in. Obviously, it's a very multifaceted definition.
I think this was used. This is Stacy from Army Civil Works. It's probably best for us to turn that over to the econ folks, because I think that's primarily where the environmental justice analysis was done, was in our econ analysis. So it might be best to start there, and then we can chime in after that.
Thank you. Is there someone who'd like to pick that up? Who do we have from econ?
Todd, are you on the line?
I don't know if we have some.
Yes, this is Todd Doley. I'm on the line.
Thank you.
And so I was just pulling up the set of entities that we looked at for the rule. And so we looked at those entities that were below the poverty threshold, below twice the poverty threshold as our low income population. We looked at various racial and ethnic groups. We looked at the demographic of folks that were older than 25, but did not have a high school diploma. We looked at linguistically isolated households, children under the age of 5, seniors over the age of 64, and those individuals that belong to American Indian tribes. Those were for this particular rulemaking analysis, those were the groups that we identified to consider for our EJ analysis.
Thank you, Todd. Stacy, did you want to add at this point? And thanks for adding those.
There. Yeah.
Thanks for adding those demographic. I missed those the first time through, so thank you. Let's see, Dr. Guggenheimer, it looks like you have something to add, and then Dr. Kaiser.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask what is the action item for us? Are we going to vote on whether we support the work group recommendations? I do very strongly.
Yes, we will. We're having discussion now, and then we will move to a vote. We would obviously be seeking consensus, but there are a variety of things that we can do depending on how that discussion goes. Thanks.
I have a question. I'm gonna raise my hand.
Yes, I think Dr. Kaiser's was up, and then Dr.
Okay,
Arnora.
sure.
I'm fine. I'm fine to wait.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Arnora.
I wanted to ask in the on the list that was mentioned, does the geospatial criterion, did that take into consideration climate justice for frontline communities?
Todd or Stacy, would you like to address, or there could be others on this call who might like to address that as well? Thank you.
This is Todd. No, it did not specifically identify communities that were particularly vulnerable to climate change. If that is something that is made available to us, we can certainly do that for the final analysis. I don't know of a data set, but it doesn't mean that one doesn't exist within EPA, but I don't know of a specific data set that we could utilize for that. But if there is one, I think that we should readily be able to incorporate that.
Okay. Yeah, it might be the CEQ recently released the climate and economic justice screening tool. It might be something that we can look into, actually. So I appreciate that comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noro. Thank you, EPA and Army Civil Works, Dr. Kaiser, and then Wilson, and I'll watch. I think there was another hand, but I don't see it this minute. Go ahead, Shuhobi.
Thank you. I just had a clarifying question in terms of when it says that we're voting here on whether or not SAB will provide comments and recommendations. Does that entail like a full review panel, or is that just the chartered members that will review this analysis?
Yeah, there are a variety of ways that we can decide to go. We can pull together a panel for a full review. And that is something that's being recommended, is that a panel review the scientific and technical underpinnings of the particular items that Dr. Rodewald laid out. We can also put in, as was mentioned, there was in February of 2020, there was a commentary, a written commentary that came out from SAB to the administrator. There's a variety of things that we can do. But yes, that's the recommendation.
And then I'm curious, can we, if we do an additional review, can we add to these points that are listed here through that review, or, okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kaiser. Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I would say that I would not refer to CEQ's tool. As some of you noted, and maybe we'll get too political here, that I critiqued the tool in many articles about its lack of inclusion of race. So there's others who are working on, there's experts who can provide some input on the types of demographic indicators that you should include. And I would say that you need to separate overburden from disadvantage. So there's a lot of conversations out there, and I would say CEQ's first tool is not the tool to look to. I prefer that you look internally at some of EPA's own work on tools. Talk to Matt Tejada and Charles Lee about some work that's ongoing right now. I don't want to speak too much of that. That'll be helpful. And also there's others who are working on indicators that will be relevant. So I'm a little concerned about some of the indicators that I heard, but I would definitely, CEQ's tool would not be the tool I would look to again. That's probably my fourth time saying that. And then as it relates to climate change, there's some climate change indicators that will be relevant to add to this, but there's a lot more work that's been done that you can look to. But again, please do not look to that tool, because that's a beta tool. The EJ Screen had 15 years of work into it. There was EJ Gap, EJ View, EJ Seat, then EJ Screen. So any work that relates to indicators and demographics, look internally to the folks on NEJAC, people who are no longer part of EPA, and folks who are currently EPA, as it relates to this discussion we're having right now, not the CEQ tool.
Can I clarify? Can I add one?
Yes, you may.
Oh, so right. So I think Todd from EPA's econ team, the EPA EJ screen tool was certainly what was used for our proposed rule. Those metrics, I think, were taken from that. The point about the CEQ tool was specific to the climate justice. So if anyone has any other ideas other than the recent CEQ tool for climate justice, and there are some that states have done, but of course not nationwide. So yeah, we can certainly look internally to EPA to see if there's any other climate data available. Appreciate that.
Yeah, this is Brian from EPA as well. I've been working with Matt Tejada and Charles Lee. I'm not sure their tools are final. So while we can have the conversation with them, I'm not sure those are final definitions or those tools are actually in final form yet, other than EJ Screen.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely again on the CoStar tools, on both CoStar tools. So I have a tool, we have a climate equity and health mapper tool that we're developing that has some climate indicators.
Right.
EPA, Charles has some ongoing work that's not final, yes, that I'm a part of. And so I will look to that work, which will be, I think, more useful than looking to CEQ too.
Gotcha.
Just
Understood.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks all of you. And I think Shuhobi had said before that that was a beta tool, which I assumed meant it wasn't final, but maybe you meant something different. Thanks. Other comments on the proposal from the work group? So what's been proposed here is to convene a panel and do a review of the scientific technical underpinnings of the WOTUS action. And the board can have a vote about that. We can also do other things, as I said, such as write a commentary to the administrator. There are other things we can do. So other comments about what the board in particular sees as important in this topic, or how deeply folks want to engage this topic, I think is also a question on the table. I can't tell if these names are correct. Dr. Omer and Dr. Rossi.
Yeah, you did great with the name, Dr. Cullen. Appreciate it. I guess just a couple thoughts on this. I'm assuming that EPA is going to provide us some more information to react to, similar to the cumulative impacts, before we take this up. And then also, I guess my second question is, do you need somebody to propose that or start the vote on that, or what is the process here?
Yeah, there would be a motion, but I think we're still probably in the discussion stage at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And Dr. Rossi.
Yeah, hi, this is Emma Rosie. I wanted to agree with the memo that was written, and that in particular, I just want to emphasize the, doing a review of the state of science, particularly with groundwater and the connection. There's been a lot of new recent research that's been done looking at the role of groundwater connecting waters, and then also, re-emphasizing the role of climate change and how there's a lot more new information. So the state of knowledge has really advanced. And so, doing a review of the current state of understanding would be really valuable when it relates to.
Thank you. And there was a review of science in an earlier action. Was it 2015? I think 2015, I don't off the top of my head. And so, we wouldn't be starting from scratch, but yes, a different action. Dr. Neptune, please go ahead.
Yeah, and 2 points. One, I was wondering if Dr. Rodewald would be able to kind of help at least me understand what the basis for the prior exclusion of groundwater was. Was there a rational basis for that? And how historic is that notion that it should be excluded? And the second issue, and this is as I try to sequence out kind of these events. So there was a prior SAB commentary in February 2020 that was reviewed by the working group. And that is being used as a basis for a reconstruction of a commentary that is to come from this panel that we're going to form.
Yeah, let me try to reframe that just slightly. So there was in 2020, that was when a different action was being proposed, and there was a commentary from SAB. We've had multiple, as you probably have read in the materials, we've had multiple definitions of waters of the US. We've had a variety of Supreme Court cases as well, and lots of discussion of the scientific and technical underpinnings. There was a fairly in-depth review in 2015. And again, that was a different definition at that time that was being reviewed. These are all related, but they are a sequence in time, and things have changed in terms of what is being proposed and what SAB is saying in response. And that is quite a long time ago now. We understand that there is an action, EPA brought us this action, and that there will be another action following this as well, because there's an action to pull back a previous definition, and then there will be an action to put a new definition in place. So what we are discussing right now is whether we as a board want to pull together a panel to do a review of the scientific and technical underpinnings of this WOTUS action. And we are, I think maybe I confused us when I said we're not starting from scratch. I just meant, this is something that has been discussed in the past, yet we tried to call out what we think are the differences and what we think are the elements that we would be focusing that review on this time. It wouldn't just be to retread old ground.
Thank you for that.
Dr. Cullen?
Thanks.
This is Russ Kaiser.
Yes, Dr. Kaiser, go ahead.
Russ Kaiser. So I was just wondering if I could give a little bit more insight as to where the agencies stand on groundwater, just for your consideration.
Yes, please.
Sure. So the agency's definition of waters of the U.S., it must comply, obviously, with the legal limits established by the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Waters Act focus is surface waters. It's not typically been groundwater. And again, in the U.S. Supreme Court recently emphasized that the Clean Water Act leaves the regulation of groundwater to the states, not the federal government. And that was in the county of Maui versus Hawaii Wildlife Fund back in 2020. So really the upshot is that Congress was fully aware of the need to address groundwater pollution, but it satisfied that the need through a variety of site-specific controls, or the need to address groundwater pollution, but it satisfied that need through a variety of state-specific tools. So Congress left general groundwater regulatory authority to the states. Its failure to include groundwater in the general EPA permitting provision was deliberate. So as a result, the agencies cannot define waters of the United States to include groundwater. However, in the past, with the exception of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, the agencies have used shallow subsurface connections to assess jurisdiction, such as whether a wetland is considered adjacent. Under the proposed rule, the agencies have taken comment on whether to return to their longstanding practice, again, which would include considerations of shallow subsurface connection when assessing if a surface water, including a wetland, is a water of the U.S. I just wanted to give that additional
for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. And if Dr. Rodewald wants to respond, I'll make space for that as well. It is interesting for folks who like to read the Federal Register to see back in the history of the Clean Water Act, the discussion, all the way on the floor of the Congress about groundwater. And over time, obviously, we've seen a lot of advances in understanding the nexus between surface and subsurface waters. And yes, so thanks for additional information there. And it looks like Dr. Neptune would like to hop in again, so go ahead. Oh, I think you might be on mute, and then I will call on Peter.
Sorry, I didn't take it down. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Dr. Thorne. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Indeed, I was. Just to follow up on what we just heard from Dr. Kaiser. So if you have a surface body of water and it's connected to another surface body of water through a groundwater channel, then that is waters of the US, right?
So, right, but there's no way to assign what the lateral limits of jurisdiction are. So while it's underwater, so therefore, yes, it's a water of the US, but there's no lateral limits or ordinary high water mark or anything like that. So that's why in the past, we've not had the groundwater connection sever that connection, especially when it's flowing and mimicking that of the surface water expression. Did that help?
I think so. I mean, we heard about ping pong balls put in one body of water that appear on the other side of the airport.
I was actually part of that when I was at Corps headquarters. I was the jurisdictional lead for that. And yes, you're exactly right. That was in Tennessee in Southern Environmental Law Center. Basically took some ping pong balls and they plopped them in where it went underground. And then they were on the downstream side, and they measured the flow rate of the ping pong ball. And they were able to demonstrate that while the ping pong ball was underground in that karst topography, it actually retained flow rates similar to the surface expression. So we did not terminate or sever the jurisdiction of the upstream waters where you had the ordinary high water mark or the wetland expression by its three parameters, right?
Thank you for that clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And it looks like Dr. Lonefight. And I then want to review the elements in the memo from the work group, one of which was about groundwater, but the others of which are about other things. Go ahead, please.
Hi. So when you say it's state specific in terms of definition, state specific, so it would be per nation for tribal nation, if there's a nation within that state. So we tribal state specific.
That would be my understanding.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for the question. So looking back at the memo, and Dr. Rodewald did an excellent job outlining this, the elements that the work group in particular was recommending that SAB would provide comments and recommendations on would be reviewing the economic analysis to determine whether EPA appropriately accounted for costs and benefits at the national level, as well as those accruing to subpopulations and regions. And we know there's been a renewed focus on subpopulations and regions in a variety of ways. The consideration of the exclusion of groundwater, which is what we've been talking about. A review of the technical support document of the proposed rule and providing recommendations related to emerging issues such as about climate change, increased precipitation and pluvial events or urban flooding, the scope and inclusivity of other waters. We've heard a little bit about that as well. And the standard called relatively permanent and the significant nexus standard, which are ways that standards in the past from Supreme Court cases that tried to identify, which waters are considered to be connected to the definition or waters that would be considered jurisdictional in light of changing hydrologic patterns. And then the final bullet in that memo said SAB would review the technical support document of the proposed rule and provide recommendations regarding new approaches to account for impacts of the proposed rule on people of color and low income and overburdened communities, for example, with geospecific analysis, and we've had a little bit of discussion about that. So that's sort of the sweep of the 4 elements that are being proposed by the work group that the SAB would look into and look at the scientific and technical underpinnings, in particular with updates over time in science and updates over time in, it's a different rule. So yes. Let's see. Don't think, is your hand still up, Lisa? I think, okay. Dr. Omer.
I guess just one comment I have is, there's a lot there in those 4 things. So your 4 bullets here. So I would just recommend that we have multiple meetings if we go down this route and decide to take this up on each of these. Because I do think there's a lot to unpack there, and I think there's a lot of expertise that applies to each one of these on this board. So just a suggestion.
Absolutely. This would be taken up by a panel, which would include SAB members and then also be augmented with any expertise that we needed from other disciplines or areas or specialties. And there would be a review, which would then come back to the board again. So there would be input at multiple levels for the whole board, and then also very targeted activity for a panel composed of SAB members and, not 47 of us talking about something, but a smaller group that actually can dig in and target, as you say, and really, and they would have a series of meetings, no question. I don't know if Tom Brennan wants to add anything about that, or if I've said anything I shouldn't, but I think that's the decision we're trying to make is, do we want to, as an SAB, do we want to take up this topic and move into that sort of panel framework of examining the underpinnings?
Yeah, there's probably several ways we can handle this depending on the scope. We could get a subset of the board. That would certainly be the fastest way to do it. If necessary, we could augment with outside expertise on particular topics of interest. But we do have a pretty good team of specialists here, including economists and ecologists and toxicologists and agricultural expertise. So I think in my eyes, there's a good chance that we have what we need in the board to set up a small group to take a leadership role if we go this route.
Yeah, thanks. And we weren't necessarily going to sort of name panelists today or something. That would be a step that we would move to next, but just trying to decide, is this something that we're going to pursue and pick up? Yeah, and it looks like Dr. Fraser, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Brian Fraser from EPA, and I just want to give a quick commentary on the intentions of the agency. As mentioned by Dr. Rodewald, EPA and Army are proposing this rule to officially put back in place the pre-2015 definitions of water of the United States, to update and reflect considerations of the Supreme Court decisions. This is a familiar approach consistent with the agency's longstanding practice prior to 2015, and with the definition of the waters of the United States that the agencies are currently implementing right now in light of our the Navigable Waters Protection Rule vacature. So just want a snapshot that, you know, we are reverting back to the pre-2015 regulations with Supreme Court cases incorporated. So we're not doing anything new moving forward right now, other than putting it in the Supreme Court cases to be recognized. And as noted, you know, we also like to say that the primary body of the science supporting this rule was based on and presented in 2015 in the science report, Conductivity of Streams and Wetlands to Downstream Waters. So the information or the regulation that we are putting back in place right now reflects that of the 2015 science report that the SAB looked at. So I just wanted to just add some context to that, so folks understand where we are, and that we're not, you know, moving forward with, you know, Rule 2 or any other action right now, but we are just reverting back to the pre-2015 regulations.
I appreciate your additions. The work group looked at the various elements and perceived some differences and some changes, and also that's why the suggested elements are on the table that are in that memo. Go ahead, Dr. Olmsted.
Yeah, I just to, as one example of what Dr. Cullen was saying, right, we noticed that the agency isn't reverting back to the old, right, economic analysis, for example, of, right, the pre-2015 rules, right. It's what's going on is something, you know, that's slightly different. And so just providing the SAB the opportunity to take a look at that and provide some feedback on that seemed important.
Thank you. So this seems like a moment when, if there are other elements aside from those 4 bullet points that folks would like to suggest that be considered, and then we will have a motion and a vote about whether this is something that SAB wants to pick up. Are there other elements that folks would like to raise? All right. So I would like to call for a motion. This would be to vote on disposition of this particular work group recommendation regarding, oh, Peter Thorne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to move that we conduct an evaluation of this WOTUS rule, and suggest that we could do that with members from the panel or from the board, and augment it as needed.
Thank you. Now, I'm not exactly sure how voting will work on the screen. Dr. Omer, we have a motion, and I think we can open it for discussion when there's a motion on the table, correct? So go ahead.
I was just going to second it, so I didn't know if you needed that right now or not. So.
Oh, thanks. Second is
that too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And then we can have discussion, or we can move to voting, and I'm going to rely on the SAB staff office to think of how we might carry out that vote. And if we were in the room together, it would usually be a show of hands, and you know, we come to consensus where possible. So Tom Armitage, as our designated federal officer, is this something where we have everyone turn off their video and then flip it on if they're voting, you know, when we say yes or no? Or do we use, you know, the yes, no in our participant functions? I don't know if everyone has access to those. I know when I'm in large group settings with my classes, not everyone has the same functionality on their Zoom, so I don't want to assume.
I'm not sure, Allison, we should proceed. You could ask for a voice vote and see if there are very many people who actually oppose it.
Yeah, let's go ahead with the voice vote, and then we can actually unpack if we have a set of people that, yeah, so we have the motion, we have the second. This is for SAB to pick up this issue suggested by the work group and to look at the scientific and technical underpinnings of this regulatory action. And I would ask folks to unmute, and all in favor say aye.
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 All opposed, please say nay. Are there any abstentions? All right, well, Tom Armitage, that worked like very smoothly because we had a unanimous vote. So thank you, work group again, and thank you, SAB. And it looks like we have a hand up from Dr. Uzo Chakwu.
No, I'm trying to hand down.
Oh, okay, trying to put your hand up. Yeah, it's tough once it goes up. Okay.
I don't know what's wrong with it, but just disregard.
All right. So we are going to now move to the work group recommendation. We had two topics in our memo. The second set of recommendations were about EPA's revised 2023 and later model year light duty vehicle greenhouse gas emission standards. Dr. Peter Thorne is going to give us a quick synopsis of the findings and recommendations for that one.
Okay, can you hear me okay, Allison?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. All right. Well, so in December 2021, the EPA finalized federal greenhouse gas emission standards for passenger cars and light trucks for the model years 2023 through 2026. And these final standards leverage advances in clean car technology to provide an estimated $190 billion in benefits. And these benefits include reduced climate pollution, improvements to public health, and saving drivers money at the pump on gasoline, which of course is especially prominent now in our minds. These emission standards are said to be the strongest ever established for the light duty vehicle sector. The EPA says they're based on sound science and grounded in a rigorous assessment of current and future technologies. The updated standards are estimated to result in avoiding more than 3 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions through the year 2050. These standards set light duty vehicle greenhouse gas program on track for EPA's next phase of standards, which are expected for model years 2027 and beyond. EPA plans a separate rule to establish multi-pollutant emission standards under the Clean Air Act for 2027 that will speed the transition to a zero emissions future. And this is consistent with President Biden's Executive Order 14037, which is entitled Strengthening American Leadership in Clean Cars and Trucks. So the work group discussed this at the two meetings that Dr. Cullen previously mentioned, and determined that the science supporting the rule, in our view, does not appear to involve new approaches that, and therefore should be peer reviewed by Science Advisory Board. In developing the rule, the EPA examined the health benefits broadly and based upon available literature and concluded that the emissions reductions would benefit vulnerable subpopulations. And this was very important to the working group. However, this was absent of a detailed analysis of the potential effects on and benefits to vulnerable communities, especially with respect to environmental justice concerns. So as this board has been discussing in our last meeting and today's meeting, the EJ issues are of supreme importance to us. And we thought that there's needed to be more specificity in that regard. The EPA also did not conduct a comprehensive geospecific analysis and modeling based on the latest science to account for potential impacts of the proposed rules on communities of color, low income, and overburdened subpopulations. The work group identified a need for the EPA to develop and apply improved analytical tools for future rulemaking. And we had some discussion of a fairly recent National Academy of Sciences report that came out on this issue titled Assessment of Technologies for Improving Light Duty Vehicle Fuel Economy 2025 to 2035. And this document was a very deep dive into this issue, and it expressed the opinion, it expressed the opinion that EPA should consider explaining how the goals and recommendations articulated in that report have been addressed, particularly those having to do with new analytical tools. So that's our request if we vote in favor of this. We recommend that in future, EPA should conduct additional analyses to better understand the extent to which changing vehicle markets, and by this we really mean increased penetration of e-vehicles, will affect the benefits and costs of vehicle greenhouse gas emissions standards. And then the last bullet refers to recommendation that future rulemakings, the EPA clearly indicate how it's addressed the recommendations received from this body. And that's the end of my summary, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Dr. Thorne. And I would just note, we really appreciated EPA bringing this rule to the work group. That was certainly noted. And it was, sort of forthcoming at that point. So time was short, and yet making some comments, not doing the sort of full panel review that we were just discussing for the WOTUS action, but making some comments because we know that over time, the regulatory process continues, and rules topics are revisited, and rules continue to evolve over time. So the idea here for this particular one is that the board should consider whether we would like to make the comments that Peter Thorne just laid out and transmit those to the EPA administrator. This would not be a situation where we're early enough in the regulatory process that engaging a panel and so forth would be quite the same as it would for the other action. So I open it up to discussion, either questions about the work group elements that they identified, or other questions that folks have about this particular rulemaking. Dr. Guggenheimer.
Let me turn on my video. I noticed in the newspaper today that the EPA is proposing new rules for heavy duty trucks. And I was wondering if someone could comment about that and whether and when it's appropriate for the SAB to become involved in that.
That's a good question. I do not know the answer, but do we have someone who does? What is the timeline for those? I think as our new process for sort of screening at the work group level and then bringing actions up to SAB has come fully into being at this point, we're going to be able to get ahead more, but we're sort of in this interim time where, yes, things do not stop happening when you're working on your process. And so, so there are different timelines attached to different actions, and I don't know the answer to your specific question, although someone else on here may. I can also just promise to look into that more and with the work group and sort of screen and see what the timeline is there. But I don't have an immediate answer for you. Does someone else? Dr. Wilson, the timeline for heavy duty.
No, I don't have a response on that. No, I can answer that question, but I'll wait to someone can, and then I'll go.
That's all right. I just Googled something here. It says August 5th, 2021, EPA announced plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful pollutants from heavy duty trucks through rulemaking over the next 3 years. The first to be finalized in 2022 will apply to heavy vehicles starting model year 2027.
So happy to take that input back to the work group. And I think this is a good time for me to also raise, as folks are looking at the regulatory agendas themselves, the working group does not want to be a gatekeeper. If there are ideas coming from the 47 of you and things that we need to be flagging and looking into on your behalf, certainly raise those. We can also do that at the board level, but we want to benefit from the entire group. So thanks. So we'll take that one back for sure and look into it and find out more about the timeline and so forth. Dr. Wilson, you've been waiting very patiently.
Oh, I just want to say I like this discussion. I just want to say that there's emerging literature and emerging needs as it relates to this issue, particularly as you think about goods movement and big trucks, warehousing, ports, seaports, and the greenhouse gases and co-pollutants. So I think Dr. Thorne's point and the work group's work around more needs to be done on the equity and justice side. There is some work. I know it was a National Academy of Sciences workshop last year that I was part of that organized around climate equity and health. And I think they're doing, actually, National Academy of Sciences is doing a 6-part series on climate equity and health. So maybe something to draw from there for the purposes of this discussion. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Others, we're open to discussion from the full board of this particular work group recommendation. We have a quiet group. Were there other elements that you would have liked to have seen in that memo raised. All right, well, the disposition here would be a little different. As I said, this would be a letter would be prepared for the administrator raising these points, acknowledging, where we are in the timeline and so forth and what's appropriate. And that would circulate, let's see, I think given that no one has raised additional elements, I think it would just carry forward, since this is what we would be voting on at this point, is the inclusion of those elements laid out by Dr. Thorne and that appear in the memo. Dr. Hamburg.
Yeah, I just want to endorse that, just as being on the working group, but I think this is an unusual situation, and it's of no fault because of the reconstituting of the SAB of the timeline. So I think it's important that we, sort of say, yes, we'd like to comment, but no, there's really no action. I mean, as the memo says, because of the timeline. So I think this is an unusual situation. And I think as we discussed in the work group, it's important to sort of establish the need, but not the specifics in this case. So I would strongly endorse that. I think anything else would just end up being a fool's errand relative to the the task, the important work we have going forward.
Thank you. Well put. And I know that, we'll have other chances in the regulatory process as other actions, related to this and so forth, as we were just discussing. So I think that transmitting those comments is a very reasonable way to go. So I would like to call for a memo, for a motion on the vote.
I move that we, so move. I second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. We can pause again for discussion since we have a motion on the floor, although it has been quiet. All right, so this motion again, sorry?
I've got a question though.
Oh, go ahead, Doctor.
Very quick question now. Do we have these work group documents? Because all I'm seeing is your memo that you sent to us. Do we have the entire documents in the report of the work group?
So I think Tom Armitage can answer what's on the website and what shows up where. We work with things that EPA brings to us, and there is where did Tom Armitage go?
Yeah, the memo, the work group memo was posted on the website and sent to everyone on the board, so with all the recommendations and suggestion comments in it.
And then we review the federal register. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, no, the actual rules are, I think there are links to those in that memorandum if people wanted to look at them in more detail. But
on the website, Tom?
Well, there were two rules. There's a proposed WOTUS rule and a final greenhouse gas emissions rule. Those are available online, and the links to those are both in the memorandum that was sent in.
So in the memo, there are links to the rules. You can read the Federal Register, and then there's also links to things such as the 2020 commentary that we were discussing before that had come from an earlier board and so forth. So those, if you see things that aren't linked, maybe this is the better way to say it, please do raise them, because we would like to know if there are things that are missing. But
thank you.
Also on the EPA, if you don't like to read the Federal Register, on the EPA website, there's a rule summary that then it has hyperlinks to all the nitty gritty. So you can just Google that at the EPA.gov.
I appreciate this being flagged though, so we'll be as clear as we could possibly be about where all the various elements are located, so folks can see all of that. And that includes, the semi-regulatory agenda, which is, ultimately we want to get ahead of these things and sort of look into the future. So for board members who are interested in looking, that is all public, and certainly all can look at it. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not about this rule, but with regard to the cumulative impacts, there was reference to a new proposal about cumulative risk assignment and a draft document that I looked for on the web and did not find.
Okay, so maybe if you could flag that in the chat, I'm thinking might be the best place to do that. And then
I'll look for it.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So we have a motion that this is for the disposition of this particular item, that there would be a letter to the administrator. It would reflect the points that were made in the work group memo, and this would be the board then speaking directly to the administrator in our role as providing advice and comments to EPA. So this motion is open. More discussion. Let's see, Dr. Thorne.
Just clarification, Dr. Cullen. Since WOTUS is going to be pulled out and have a separate effort on that, this would be a letter from you on behalf of the board, specifically on this one agenda item.
Yes, that sounds right. I think a letter on each one makes sense, although I'll wait for Tom Armitage to tell me if he sees that differently.
Well, I think that's certainly your your decision. We could put them both in one letter and talk about them in the same letter and what the board's planning to do, and also providing comments regarding the greenhouse gas rule. But I would, that's up to you, Allison.
Yeah, even though the decisions are not to pursue this in the same way for both, I suppose we could put everything into one. If we felt that somehow one of them would take more time to pull together than the other, maybe it makes sense to take them apart and do them separately or something like that.
Yeah, Allison, that was my suggestion. I mean, my preference would always to go the fastest way to deliver the advice and to clear it up. From where we're sitting, where I think we're going, I think the fastest way is to split them up.
Yeah, it wasn't for any other reason except expediency. So I'm on Tom Brennan's page. He's trained me well, or we've trained each other well or something. So yeah, so why don't I go ahead and call for the vote then, unless there are other discussion points that folks wish to raise. All right, well, I will call for vote. And since it worked pretty well to do it as a verbal call, I would ask you to unmute, and all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All opposed? Are there any abstentions? All right, we have a unanimous vote, so thank you for your attention. And I think this is a good time to call for a 10-minute break. It's just about 11:30 here on the West Coast. So why don't we reconvene? What would that be then? What is it here? It's 11:28. So at 11:38, we will reconvene, and we have another item to get back into, which is our MARSIM quality review. Thanks all. See you in 10 minutes.
Hi, Richard. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, here I am. Yes. How are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Oh, fine. Yes. I just had a small appointment over at Duke Hospital this morning, so that delayed me getting to the meeting, but I'm back now.
Oh, that's good. Well, you're just in time. We're on a 7-minute break. Or it was a 10-minute break. Now it's down to about 3 minutes, I guess.
Hi, Dan. It's John. I'll just say hello before
Hi,
you
John.
launch.
How are you?
Hi there. I'm good. How's LA? Warm.
It's cold. It was cold. 41 degrees when I woke up this morning.
We were about 10 and the snow was melting, starting to melt off. So
Doing any climbing or skiing or bicycling?
doing a lot of cycling, a lot of hiking. Yep. It's good. Although we've just had a run of winter. Unfortunately, it was too warm through December. Now cold, but haven't been up enough snowshoeing this year.
All right, why don't we reconvene? Welcome back, everyone. Looks like some people may have gone outside for a few minutes. I love that. So important when some of us are still working out of the house and things like that. All right, let me just look quickly here. as I had mentioned before, we will have a public comment period, a second one toward the end of today. And I just wanted to see if I had any information about how many speakers we have for that. All right, well, we'll look into that. Yeah, so welcome back. We have a next item, which is the quality review of an SAB draft report on the multi-agency radiation survey and site investigation manual. And as I said before, quality reviews are done by the full board when reports come back from panels that are constituted to do SAB business. So that's the step that we're involved in. So we have the report, we have a chance for folks to ask questions and raise comments, which we have now in writing. So we'll go ahead and begin that quality review. So this is a key function of the SAB. And we will make a determination as a board about the quality of the report because it would be speaking on our behalf. We're going to hear a brief introduction from Dr. Dan Stram. He was the chair of the SAB Radiation Advisory Committee. And they were the group that conducted this review of MARSIM. And they also had the augmentation, the addition of several additional experts. And then we'll hear comments from SAB members designated as lead reviewers. And we have 4 people who are going to sort of lead that off. And then after hearing those lead reviewer comments, I'll ask Dr. Stram if he would like to provide any sort of a response. And then the remainder of the SAB board would be invited to offer additional comments as part of that quality review. So our discussion is going to focus on 4 questions that are the responsibility of the SAB. And you had these questions in your materials. The first one is, were the original charge questions to the SAB panel, were they adequately addressed by this report? The second one is about whether there are any technical errors or omissions in the report or issues that are inadequately dealt with in this panel report. The third question is whether the panel's report is clear and logical. And the fourth one is whether the conclusions drawn or the recommendations provided are supported by the body of the panel's report. And then I'll entertain a motion about the disposition of this draft report. So Dr. Stram, I see you on the screen. Please give us your summary of the report.
Sure. I'd like to see the slides, please.
Can you see them now?
I see them now. So we're going to talk about the draft multi-agency radiation survey and site investigation manual, known as MARSIM, revision 2. Revision 1 is the current one. Revision 2 is the proposed. Next slide, please. To give you some background, MARSIM provides information on planning, conducting, evaluating, and documenting surface and surface soil radiological surveys for demonstrating compliance with requirements. 4 agencies jointly developed the document. Each of the 4 have some responsibility for radioactive material and in particular cleanup, used for large and small sites from decommissioning small factory buildings up to former nuclear power plants and weapons production facilities. The other MARS documents cover other aspects of radiological, there's MARSAME for materials and equipment, MARLAB for analytical protocols. EPA has been offering training courses for MARSIM users for about 20 years with about 60 attendees per year. That gives you some idea of the audience size for this. Next slide, please. The charge questions from EPA mainly relate to updates in MARSIM R2 from MARSIM R1. Next slide, please. Charge question 1 was, are revisions to MARSIM concepts and technologies technically appropriate, useful, and clear, and do they provide a practical and implementable approach to performing environmental surveys of soil and building surfaces? I'm going to summarize each of 5 sub-questions. Next slide, please. The first is about scan-only surveys. These are sort of modern ways of scanning large fraction of a site that's being considered for release. There's technological advancements are not adequately addressed. Our findings are that technological advancements for scan-only surveys are not adequately addressed in the draft revision. And SAB highly encourages additional guidance development for scan-only methodologies. Next slide, please. The second one is a statistical question, inclusion of scenario B in determining whether release criteria have been met. The panel agrees with the inclusion of scenario B, but only when scenario A is infeasible, i.e. when the release criteria is close to background. Scenario A assumes the level of radioactive material fails to meet the release criteria until proven otherwise, whereas scenario B assumes that the level of radioactive material in the survey unit meets the release criteria until proven otherwise. So under scenario B, retrospective power analysis is needed to confirm that the study had sufficient power to detect a survey unit that should not have passed. To give you some idea of what's going on, the sample size required is a function of the width of the so-called gray region, which has an upper bound and a lower bound. And what happens if the width of the gray region becomes small because the release criteria, here the DCGL, if that is reduced towards zero, then the sample size calculated would become infeasibly large. And so what's proposed, what's deemed appropriate in that situation is to revert to scenario B and then to widen the gray region with sort of renaming the lower bound of the gray region to be the action level and the upper bound of the gray region to be the discrimination limit. And discrimination limit is simply that level that can be detected reliably to be different from the action level. So the retrospective analysis, power analysis is required in order to make sure that a poorly designed study, one without, under scenario B, a poorly designed study, one without a large enough sample size to detect, is not used to justify a release. In other words, if you make a crappy study, you know, the power analysis is what you rely on. Next slide, please. There's other statistical questions that were raised for scenario B, and we basically agreed with the EPA, except on the size of the lower bound of the gray region reaction limit. And setting that to 3 times the uncertainty and background level may be overly forgiving. The general comment that we make in the response to charge question 1.2 is that MARSIM is a very challenging read, even for the statistically well-versed. You know, and the jargon used is quite specialized. And there's further need for, there's a need for additional material to define and clarify key concepts. And we provided an outline of such material. Next slide, please. Next slide. Charge question 1.3 is about measurement quality objectives, or MQOs. And the SAB finds that the description of the concepts of method uncertainty and measurement uncertainty and their implementation to be inadequate and unclear. MARSIM should distinguish between a priori method uncertainties versus measurement uncertainties remaining after measurements are taken. So it's sort of, you know, what you what you think is might be going on until you see the data, and then afterwards what you measure, the uncertainty that you measure. And a worked out calculation, one of the so specifically a worked out calculation of required method uncertainty should be provided. And then a lot of the sample size calculations appearing in MARSIM are based on counting statistics for Poisson counts, but other kinds of methods such as TLD badges, which are integrative rather than instantaneous, needs discussion. MARSIM should briefly describe how correlated uncertainties are included in uncertainty propagation. That's a standard uncertainty propagation formula, but it needs to be expanded to deal a bit with correlated uncertainties. Next slide. Then the concept of detection capability is adequately described and implemented in MARSIM. Examples of computing uncertainty should include non-statistical uncertainties. This arises in several places. Non-statistical uncertainties, or what is sometimes known as type B uncertainties, are uncertainties based on expert or experience or expert knowledge. The computation of measurement uncertainties should take into account also systematic as well as random uncertainties by including them in error propagation. More thorough and realistic examples of computing measurement uncertainty and assessing whether project MQOs have been made or needed. So all of this is about the design of the study. Next slide, please. The role of scan-only methods for quantifying mean concentrations as well as detecting anomalies needs further clarification. In my view, this is one of the most important suggestions of our report. Right now, the report, the MARSIM document revision is not clear. It's self-contradictory in terms of whether the scan-only methods are just used to detect anomalies or whether they can actually be used for quantification of concentrations, which is what's needed to show regulatory, that you've met the regulatory requirements. Each measurement should have an associated uncertainty expected as a standard deviation that's used in the final standard combined uncertainty. And that is despite some stakeholder complaints that this makes things difficult for scan-only methods. And then the panel agrees with keeping the original MARSIM requirement of a measurement method with minimum detectable concentration between 10 and 50% of the upper bound of the gray region, so long as they relate to data quality objectives. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to talk, look at charge question 1.4, which is questions about elevated measurement comparison and the unity rule. The panel finds that the discussion of survey requirements for multiple areas of elevated radioactivity needs some further clarification. The panel finds that the unity rule should be maintained in MARSIM as it provides a consistent approach for conservative dose or risk estimate assessment. When applied to several radionuclides at the same site, the unity rule takes this form: the sum over the dose or risk component and then divided by the release criteria, and that becomes the concentration level divided by the wide concentration guideline limit, the DCGL. For summing over several nuclides at the same site, you simply check to see that the sum of these ratios together are less than or equal to 1. And what's really needed for the elevated multiple comparison is a modification of this that's applied to isolated areas of elevated contamination. It's a little more complicated. I decided not to show the formula. Next slide, please. And then to finish 1.4, we're asking for detailed examples of using the unity rule, and also just to flesh out the comment that if sufficient data is available, site-specific dose risk calculation could be performed using an acceptable exposure pathway model. The unity rule applied to different locations can be quite conservative and maybe needlessly conservative if there is enough data to look at risk, dose risk calculations for a specific site. Thank you. So next slide. And then on to some sort of an interesting phenomenon, the discrete radioactive particles. These are point sources, sorry. The discussion of discrete radioactive particles was mainly limited to a cautionary statement of advising against using the EMC process when DRPs are discovered. Exposure pathways for DRPs are very distinctly different. These are highly mobile. They can get on people's skin. They can get on clothing and be brought home. So the exposure pathways are quite a bit different than other wide area, more widespread radioactive contamination. The discussion in MARSIM revision 2 of a proposed rule of thumb for deciding when not to use the EMC process and deal with the DRPs, that is, and an alternate rule for identifying DRPs is suggested based on a threshold distance of count data to reach perhaps 1/2 of the maximum value. Next slide. Charge question 2. Does MARSIM revision 2 provide useful, appropriate, and clear examples and descriptions of technical approaches to implementing surveys and statistics by which they are interpreted? Next slide. So charge question 2.1 was specifically about chapter 6, which covers a lot of different measurement methods and instrumentation, and also chapter 8, appendix H. The panel finds technical approaches and statistics to be generally useful and accurate, but recommends improvements to chapter 6 to incorporate uncertainties in the C conversion factor of the minimum detectable concentration. And in addition to uncertainties due to Poisson County statistics, the dependence of the minimum detectable concentration on factors involved in survey measurement process, sample surface type, source efficiency, source to detector geometry, and associated uncertainty should be acknowledged and incorporated into the uncertainty of the MDC, the factor C. And then we want to provide statistical techniques for modern data logging systems that no longer rely on human surveyor implementation, and include updated information on measuring radon and its decay progeny. Next slide. Additionally, the SAB finds that Appendix H is useful and generally accurate, but could be improved, and several suggestions are provided. Next slide. The next question is a statistical one. It's about the use of rank set sampling in sampling design. So rank set sampling is a sampling design that can provide an estimate of the mean that has smaller uncertainty than mean estimates from simple random sampling. How does that happen? Well, it applies when a radionuclide of interest may be hard to measure, but there exists an easy to measure variable that's correlated with the radionuclide of interest. That's so our findings actually are that the MARSIM work group should consider dropping RRS from MARSIM2 unless its usefulness to MARSIM can be better described. We felt it was not adequately described in what we reviewed. If not dropped, then more thorough discussion of examples is recommended. Alternate methods such as regression or calibration should be added, and more details should be given about the source of the data used in the example 5. Next slide. So, and then the charge question 2.3, this is a simple one, just were changes in chapter 5, did they help or hinder? And we believe that it helps and are useful, but could be additional detail could be useful for better clarity. Next slide. Charge question 3, is the information in MARSIM revision 2 clear, understandable, and presented in a logical sequence? How can the presentation and content of material be modified to improve the understandability of the manual? Next slide. This is the last charge question. Next slide. So the first question was about the lower bound of the gray region. I'm sorry, go back to the previous slide. Was about the lower bound of the gray region. Setting the lower bound too high because of using a high-sided rule of thumb increases sample size and survey costs compared to using more realistic estimates of the mean concentration of the residual radioactive material. And our finding is so long as sufficient preliminary data exist, that what is in the manual should lead to a use of more realistic LBGR, and then therefore put less reliance on high-sided rule of thumb bounds. But when preliminary data do not exist, then the reliance on such rules of thumb can't be avoided. And the development of a good case study is recommended here. Next slide. And then there were questions about area factors. The area factor is the ratio of the elevated measurement comparison release criteria to the wide area release criteria, i.e. area factor is equal to ECGL EMC divided by DCGL W. So what is really going on here? This is taking account that you can permit a small area to be above the release criteria as long as the majority of the a wider area is below the release criteria. And then and so the problem with area factor being given as this ratio is that they've been misapplied to calculate the DCGLEMC as just some kind of published area factor for a particular radionuclide times the DCGLW. The MARSIM revision 2 focuses on direct development of site-specific DCGLEMC and avoids the use of the term area factor. So the panel agrees with removal of the area factor terminology, and the use of area factor is still found in many sections within the MARSIM document, so that they need to be revised appropriately. Next slide. this is a very simple question, and the answer is yes, we agree that the new organization is good. However, additional work is needed, and we provide some suggestions for improvement. Next slide. And then another very simple question about moving derivations from Chapter 5 to Appendix O. We agree with that. It improves clarity. The only thing is we found that there's there's redundancy. The last bullet point here is that the 0.5 and 0.6 are duplicative of Chapter 4. Next slide. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank the panel members on the board and special shout out to Dr. Diana Wong, our DFO on this project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Stram. Really appreciate this. Before we go to our next step, I think I might just sort of review for people who are newer to this in light of some of the earlier comments, where we are. So the MARSIM report, EPA's Office of Air and Radiation requested that the SAB review the MARSIM revision 2 report. If you look at our meeting materials website, you can see the whole report. Then the panel that Dr. Stram just appreciated, they have now reviewed, and a set of charge questions were brought from EPA. So they now went through and answered whether, for EPA, whether they thought that the report met those various charge questions. And now we are reviewing, as a quality review, we're reviewing the report that little panel of people drawn from the SAB board, augmented with some experts. Their review of the MARSIM is what we are now looking at and saying, is this something that we feel is complete and ready to go? So as an SAB, are we ready? So we have 4 SAB members who were not necessarily part of that board, who will lead off as lead reviewers of this document. And for folks who are very familiar with this, I apologize for going through it all, but I'm sort of sensing it is kind of complicated, right? There's a document and then there's a pretty lengthy review of that document. And now we're doing a quality review of the review. So appreciate the overview from Dr. Stram, and we have 4 lead reviewers from the SAB who are going to give comments in response to the quality review questions. And that's Dr. Mark Borsak, Dr. Amin Chen, Dr. John Samet, and Dr. Peter Thorne. So go ahead, Dr. Borsak.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that overview, Allison. I think I didn't fully appreciate the role I was serving here in terms of as lead reviewer. I kind of assumed it was to summarize comments that came up from the other reviewers. So I have relatively little of new things to say. I think, I did, in terms of addressing the quality review questions, I did feel that the committee did a good job of addressing the charge questions that were posed to them as listed in Appendix A. I think overall they were thorough and appropriate in addressing those comments. As far as technical errors, I'm again thinking that I was serving more as a role of summarizing some of those. I'm not an expert on this specific topic. I haven't worked on this specific area with these methods before, but with my familiarity of statistical methods and uncertainty analysis, I didn't identify any technical errors or omissions in the draft review report. I thought the report was well organized and clearly written and logically constructed, and that the recommendations that they put in their cover letter in particular were well supported by the draft report itself. So I realize that those are all fairly high level kind of summary comments, but overall I did feel like the review was appropriate and thorough. So again, I'd be happy to serve in the role of one of the lead reviewers in terms of assimilating comments that others have made who may have more either expertise in this area or have delved more deeply into some of the specific methods.
Thanks, Dr. Borsak. Dr. Chen.
Oh, thanks, Allison. And Dr. Borsak also provided good comments related to the overall quality. I totally agree with that. The panel provided an excellent summary and report to request EPA to update the scan-only methodology and distinguish several uncertainties: method uncertainty and required method uncertainty and measurement uncertainty. and also address the challenges posted by the discrete radioactive particles. So the report is well written, recommendations either supportive or requesting EPA to improve the mass SAM report are very clear. So I do have one minor comment about the recommendations. So in the report, the multiple places the panel recommends EPA to provide a better working examples to facilitate the understanding, not only statistics, but also just like operation-wise for the readers to use real world scenarios, but that is not highlighted in the overall summary recommendations at the beginning of the document. I think that could be highlighted because this would be, probably the administrator will pay more attention to the beginning sections. And the review panel actually also need to consider the narration or communication aspect of the report, because the prior feedback from the users of the report is that the report can be difficult to understand for field workers. So that is the minor comments. And on technical side, I did not find any specific issues. So although I would suggest the panel can recommend a little more specifics for the for the EPA to consider. For example, the figures 5.7, 5.8 that's already showing by Dr. Stram. So it's better probably to provide the meaning of what each section of the gray area, or what's the upper end or the lower end, what's really the meaning of each section, and what's the action level would be. So, and also for the examples that the panel would recommend the EPA to highlight, it's probably better to provide some specifics what EPA need to highlight in those examples. And also for the introductory material, and also for the uncertainty, maybe, to have some tables and figures to really helping the readers to understand the difference between all of these concepts and the methodology. So that's pretty much there's only one thing about the ranked set sampling. I think the panel recommend either dropping the ranked set sampling, RSS, or to enhance it with more like understanding more details. I'm a little confused whether actually what's the best way for the EPA to consider. I think that seems like this method is still used, and I probably think it's better to keep it in the report, but provide a little more details. But the panel is recommending either dropping or really adding more details. That's not very clear to me. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Dr. Samet.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add. I mean, this is an extraordinarily technical exercise that was undertaken. I went and looked at the Marsom revision itself, and it's quite impenetrable. And I, congratulate the panel on making their way through it and providing comments. I mean, I think it's a good report. I think looking across the comments provided by SAB members, I think there's some things to consider, as Dr. Chen just suggested, that in terms of revisions, but I think it does a good job of giving guidance on how to revise the Marsom, and I think that the report stands is quite well done.
Thank you, Dr. Samet. Our final lead reviewer is Dr. Peter Thorne.
Yeah, I thought Dan and his group did really a fantastic job with this. The charge questions were addressed specifically and in great detail. I didn't find any deficiencies there. On technical errors or omissions, as John Samet said, this kind of went into the really deep weeds, and so I'm not sure I would have recognized any beyond what they identified. With regard to the draft being clear and logical, it was really quite coherent with regard to the charge questions. I like that it clearly stated that the draft Marsom was most technically sound, and that the concerns and deficiencies were primarily regarding the clarity of the writing and helping the reader understand the statistical approach with some examples. I thought that was good. So all in all, I thought they did a great report, and I'm highly supportive of their action.
Thank you. And Dr. Stern, would you like to respond to any of the comments or just reflect any additional details?
I would like to respond to some of the comments of Dr. Chen if I can. So Dr. Chen asked us to consider the narration and communication aspects of the material to make it easier to understand. Regarding narration, we've already asked for introductory materials to be added to the MARSIM. And then regarding communication, I'm not sure we understood his question here, but I did note in my talk that EPA has been offering training courses for users, but assessment of communication efforts is out of the scope of our charge. And then Dr. Chen makes some editorial suggestions about figure 5.7 and 5.8 in the manual. We can add editorial comment to the Appendix B of the report to deal with that. But I think the biggest one here is when recommending, Dr. Chen asked for more details to be added to our various requests for additional working examples. Can someone show the table on the screen? It would be, I guess, yes, that's right. And I don't know if it can be made more, I guess it's readable. So here we've listed in response to the written question, some of the places where we're asking for recommendations. And I just wanted to go through some of them. In charge question 1.2, there's a request for examples. This is related to the statistics that appeared, regarding the acceptance of scenario B, and then our overall addition of an outline of material to be used. And in our opinion, what this request is for a step-by-step case study using all the statistical tests mentioned in MARSIM to determine if they can be released. I think if a site can be released is pretty clearly implied by the context in which this example came up. In section 1.3, there were several requests, and we asked for a step-by-step example of determining method uncertainty and required measurement method uncertainty. We asked for specific detailed examples of how to calculate the combined standard uncertainty for different measurement methods. We asked for a fully worked out example of determining an MDC in chapter 6. And, we feel that these are pretty clear requests that we don't need any real additional detail put on them. We asked in a discussion of the unity rule for 2 examples, one where showing the acceptance, and one showing failure. And so, we believe that's pretty clear. Revision to example 9 for section 2. So for charge question 2.1, we asked for a revision of example 9 to include calculation of combined uncertainty, including uncertainty in instrument efficiency. So this would be, one of these systematic errors to be included in the uncertainty analysis. And then regarding rank set sampling, we asked for determination of the data source and a discussion of how high the correlation needs to be in order to gain information beyond that provided by simple random sampling. Sorry, turn this one. And then finally, in section 3.1, we asked for lower bound of the gray region to be provide an example that determines the lower bound of the gray region. and have that replace what exists now, which is just a short list of possible preliminary data sources about likely background level. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Stram. Yeah, thanks very much. And to the whole panel, I mean, great, detailed, very thorough report from the panel. And thanks to the lead reviewers. I'm opening it up now to other SAB members who might like to comment on the report. And I see that Tom Brennan, go ahead.
Yes, this is not a technical comment, but it is an acknowledgement. I'd like to thank Dr. Stram, the entire team, and Diana Wong, our DFO. This particular project straddled the time that we were working, and then we were resetting and bringing it back up. We've got a very, very technical document, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved with this. It took a lot of grit to restart it well and to bring the plane home and land the plane. So I just would be remiss if I didn't say a special thank you to our chair, our panel, and our DFO. So thank you all.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. It was quite a task.
Thank you, Dr. Stram, and all the members. So SAB, would you like to comment any further? We've had our 4 lead reviewers. Other comments about the panel report? Perhaps the person who said impenetrable is reflecting right now that might have been an appropriate comment. I mean, for many, this is not area of expertise, but it's an important function.
Written comments by Dr. Morris.
Dr. Morris.
Yeah, this is Dr. Morris.
There you are.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The only thing I noticed is that there's contradictory definitions of discrete radioactive particles. I'm sure it's a typo. One place they say it's less than a micron in diameter, and another they say it's 100 micrometers in diameter. So you just need to clear it up.
Right.
It makes a big difference between those.
I think we'll use the wording from millimeter to micron.
Probably.
That's what the Marson manual uses.
Yeah.
I think we can use that too.
Yep.
Thanks for that comment. Are there other SEB members who would like to comment? And we do have some written comments that have been submitted, and that will certainly be still open for folks who would like to comment in writing after this meeting as well. Other verbal comments?
I know Dr. Chakraborty had some written comments.
Jay, would you like to add anything?
Not really beyond what I wrote. Those are just minor errors or typos. I just had, I mean, of course, in terms of readability and clarity, I agree with the comments that have already been made, so I don't want to repeat that. But I think there are certain terms like statistical uncertainties and that often have multiple meanings in the literature. So I had asked for possible clarification of some of those things, but these are relatively minor issues. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Jay. Are there others? Well, I think we will again appreciate Dr. Stram and the panel for amazing work and spread out over quite a bit of time and over quite a few different circumstances as well. So thank you so much. And the disposition of this report would flow as follows. So I would now ask for a motion for an SAB decision. So you saw in your materials that there is a review and then also a letter to the administrator that would be signed by Dr. Stram and myself that would come from SAB, from all of us, with this panel having spoken on our behalf and with our comments and with our quality review. And the motions that we would usually see in a case like this could fall into the following categories. We can approve this report either as is or subject to some kind of editorial changes or review, but that could be sort of small things and just flowing through myself as chair, the staff office, and in consultation with Dr. Stram if necessary. We could approve the report, but subject to re-review by a certain set of designated SAB members. I didn't really hear anyone suggesting something like that. Return of the draft report to the authoring panel for further work. I didn't actually hear anything that sounded like that either. Or, recommending that the SAB staff office constitute an entirely new panel that does a whole new review. Again, I didn't hear anything that that had that particular sound to it. So I would like to ask for a motion, and it's from what we've heard so far, I think it would fall into one of those categories. It'd either be approval of the report as is, subject to some of these sort of editorial and smaller comments that could be handled through myself, with Dr. Stram if necessary, and through the SAB staff office. Or if someone would like to move something else, I am listening, but I don't think we've heard anything that sounded like that thus far. Would anyone like to make a motion?
Yeah, I have a hand up.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Thorne.
Yeah, I think this definitely falls into bucket one. It's, the comments are very, very minor and can easily be addressed with the chair and you, Dr. Stram and Dr. Cullen. So I motion for the first option to advance the thing with minor edits.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Dr. Morris, are you seconding?
Second.
Okay, we have several seconds. All right, so the motion that we're going to vote on is approval of the report, and with small editorial changes that will be handled sort of in that vein of just through the chair. And given what you've heard, there wouldn't be anything substantive. So we're going to vote on that motion. All in favor, please unmute and say aye.
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 Aye. Aye. Thank you. Are there any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we have a unanimous vote, and thanks to the excellent work from this panel and this chair, really, I mean, that's the credit is there. Great work. All right, we now have a second public comment period available, and there was one request for public comment. We have a speaker, it's Beto Lugo from Clean Air Now. I believe he is on our call. Let's see. Go ahead, Beto.
Yeah, hi. Beto Lugo with Clean Air Now in Kansas City. I couldn't make the first meeting, so I missed some of that, but I did look at the recording, the YouTube video that's out there. And so, I just wanted to share that this past Friday, the reason I didn't make it on Friday is because we had the administrator, Region 7, recently appointed administrator, visiting our area here in Kansas City. And we highlighted the issues, right? The cumulative impacts on our communities from the heavy duty freight sector. As you all know, a NOx rule passed, there's a NOx rule today that there's a press release on that. And we also shared about the impacts, right? Not just from one source of pollution, but many in our community. So one of the things that I did see that I heard in the previous recording is that, and I just wanted to highlight, I guess it was for clarification, that ORD should focus on ensuring there's infrastructure to work with communities and use community generated data in decision-making. EPA should urgently work to implement and standardize methods to incorporate data collected in the community, so community level data to fill in those gaps. We know that we have EJ Screen, we have EJ Atlas, and then recently released EJ Screen, but we know that there's a lot of data that is missing, right? That can be utilized in the processes, right? And how do we make sure we look at all this from a holistic approach? And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is around in the cumulative impact assessment, EPA should be sure to include chemical and non-chemical stressors, because you can disentangle structural racism, redlining, et cetera, from other chemical exposures. And also just wanted to share around the RMPs. I know this is not specific to RMPs, but we want to make sure that we look at those as well, because our communities also don't have a good plan in place. So that's just a little bit of just a comment. I just wanted to just make sure I was here to share a little bit of what I saw. And again, I apologize for not being there at the first meeting, so I didn't capture all of it. It was 4 hours, so I couldn't go through the whole thing, but just wanted to share that. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your comment and for taking the time to be with us and bring us your thoughts. Really appreciate that. And it is time out of your busy schedule, so really appreciating that you came. I would open it up to SAB members. Would anyone like to ask a question of our speaker? Any thoughts? Christy Pullen-Fednick, go ahead.
I think just to thank you, Beto, for coming and giving these comments, and just being able to make the time for these meetings, I think can be really difficult in a lot of ways. So I just appreciate you being here. Just wanted to say that.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Florence Honoro.
Dr. Honoro, go ahead.
I wanted to thank him again for lending that community voice, and I believe we have actually been addressing part of that during our first meeting and this one. So it's good for you to hear that those voices we're addressing that, and hopefully somewhere along the line incorporating that into the cumulative impact assessment. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noro. Beto, did you want to respond in any way, or are you concluding?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. That concludes the second public comment period. And I think we now move to closing remarks. We actually were incredibly efficient with our time today. And so I want to thank everyone involved, the excellent planning from the SAB staff office, and all of you for organizing and preparing materials ahead of time and presenting and bringing your comments in such an efficient and effective way. I feel that we've had a very productive meeting, so appreciating the SAB members and also EPA and others who are with us. Appreciating the public for bringing the public voice to us, which we need so much. I will work with Dr. Strom to move the MARSIM report forward in accordance with the decision that we made, so we're all set with that. I will work with Tom Armitage, the designated federal officer, and we'll develop letters to EPA. One will be transmitting the SAB comments on the consultation that we had on cumulative impacts. So we'll be pulling all of that together. Please do send your final written comments to Tom Armitage by the 25th of March. And if you need his email address, he can put it in the chat, but it's also on, of course, on our website, and you also have been receiving email from him. He will send you a follow-up email so that you can just respond in kind if you wish. Then we will also take follow-up steps to implement the board decisions that we made today about the 2 EPA planned actions with letters to the administrator, as we discussed. And I would just pause for a minute and ask if there are any questions from board members about any of what we're planning to do moving forward in these next steps. I want to say I've really appreciated the questions and comments along the way from folks who are newer to the process. When something seems like it's not completely making sense, like please do flag that and make sure that we are being very clear about our communications about what step we're in of a process or what we're responding to or whose hand, whose court is the ball in and things like that. So those comments have been appreciated, because once you're sort of enmeshed in it, it can be hard to see where the confusion can be. So appreciate that as well. If there are no further questions or comments, I will ask Tom Armitage, our designated federal officer, to adjourn the meeting, please.
Thanks very much, Allison. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will summarize the action items, and it will also request your final comments for the consultation. And I'll be sending that out. And thank you all very much. And with that, if there are no other questions or issues to talk about, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Looking forward to engaging again.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Allison.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a great day, y'all.
Fine. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.